Well, why have you opposed the idea of manned flights?
Most of the jobs that we want to do at this time in space can be done far better, more cheaply, and without personal risk, and with greater continuity with unmanned vehicles. To use men to take unmanned satellites into orbit, I personally think it's crazy. I mean, to make the whole thing a dangerous enterprise when it doesn't need to be that, I see no reason for that. The notion that practicing space flight in low orbit around the Earth takes you any nearer to any of the desirable manned space enterprises, I think it's just plain wrong. You know, I would be most enthusiastic if we could really fly to the stars, or God knows what people are talking about. We cannot even conceive of flying to the nearest planet, to Mars, and land there with a manned mission, so long as we don't have some great new invention of a totally different propulsion system. So long as we have to do it with chemical rockets, we are not going to mount a manned flight even to the nearest planet. So why do it? What are we gaining from practicing in close Earth orbit?
Let me just put back the arguments that NASA's used for the shuttle, that it is very versatile, that it is cheaper, that it is reusable, that it can bring men into a position where they can do things like repair satellites that instruments or mechanical devices cannot do.
You will never bring the money for the shuttle back from repair work. I mean, that is just absolutely outlandish to think that you will repair that many things as to make good the investment in the shuttle. And the other stories, that it is versatile, but what has it been used for? For public relations work, and for various attempts so far quite unsuccessful in making any space
Well, what has been lost scientifically by devoting so much money proportionately to manned space flight, say since the landing on the moon? What has been lost scientifically that could have been gained by using the money otherwise?
You've seen how wonderful the spacecraft, the unmanned spacecraft to the outer planets were, and what magnificent results were brought back from them. The amount of experimentation that could have been carried out had we not devoted this huge amount of money to the manned spaceflight, that could have been used for perfecting such remote control, I don't want to say robots, but remotely controlled machinery. We could have progressed far further in that direction, and we could have had much more wonderful vehicles still than the Voyager. We would have had much better communication systems, because our present method of launching communication satellites is extremely clumsy. I'm sure that the unmanned vehicles will win the day. The European Ariane will almost certainly launch most of the future communication satellites. All that could have progressed very much further, and many scientific missions were cancelled. I'm myself a scientist and would like to see the scientific missions, but I fully realize that the utilitarian use of space is terribly important.
Can I ask you to come back to the question of risk? Is it your argument that NASA has deliberately misled the country about the degree of risk involved in putting men up to do these things?
That would be a very fierce accusation. What they have done, however, is, I think, imprudently used manned flight, which has a great deal of public appeal, and they've used it for the public relations aspect to a great extent, and they have then made what I think was just a pretense that manned spaceflight was going to be of some advantage for the utilitarian and for scientific satellites. For that, I think it has no advantage at all.
Do you think today's tragedy should cause the government and NASA to rethink this whole shuttle program and what is supposed to follow it?
I certainly think that, yes. I certainly think that one should think very hard about using any man in space where he's not absolutely needed or where he's not directly contributing to the future of spaceflight. Just to go and practice with more people in the same low orbit and do it time and again 15 times a year, I think it is just a totally unnecessary and unwarranted risk.
Well, thank you. We'll come back. Jim?
Yes, we go now to a man who was an astronaut on the first flight of Space Shuttle Challenger in April 1983. He's retired Air Force Colonel Donald Peterson, now an independent aerospace consultant, and he joins us tonight from Houston. Colonel Peterson, Dr. Gold said this whole thing is crazy to send man into space on the shuttle. Is he right?
Clearly, I would disagree with Dr. Gold. I really don't know Dr. Gold, and it's a little difficult discussing things in a matter of minutes that probably deserve some study. But I think even Dr. Gold would have to admit that, for example, if you compare what man can do as opposed to what can be done with automated systems, man is far more capable, far more flexible, and you only have to look at, for example, the difference between the United States and the Soviet lunar program to realize that we did far more in the way of understanding and learning about the moon by putting men there than the Russians were able to do with automated systems. So I think the orbiter, excuse me, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so his basic charge that we would be further along, there would be more progress in space exploration with less manned space flight, you just say is wrong, huh?
I think if you measure progress in terms of how many devices you might launch, Dr. Gold might be right, but I think if you measure progress in terms of our capacity to live and work and do meaningful things in space, that man is far more capable than machines.
What about his charge that NASA was interested in the public relations aspect of this, of sending man into space?
I think NASA is interested in good public relations in all of their programs. I don't see any difference in good public relations in the manned space program and in the Discoverer satellite that's out looking at Uranus and in our interest in those pictures. I'm not against good public relations.
Yeah. Did you feel as an astronaut that you were a tool of NASA public relations rather than as a scientist trying to explore the heavens?
No, sir, I didn't feel that way. I suppose if you ask 100 people, you get 100 different answers. But I think most of the people here feel that what we do in space is very important and that a manned capability is very important. And I think most of us feel very lucky to have been able to participate.
All right, you flew in this spacecraft in 1983. Do you have any theories as to what might have happened this morning?
No, sir, I don't. I saw the same films that undoubtedly you've seen. And I don't think it really serves any purpose to speculate, and I don't know what happened.
Did you and other astronauts, did you discuss the dangers that were involved in doing this kind of thing?
Not in exactly those words. I think any person who's a career astronaut and who's watched space programs over the years understands that there's some element of risk in any flight. I think if you decide you want to be a career astronaut, you accept that risk, and then you learn to do your job and you do it. And I don't think you spend a great deal of time worrying about and discussing risks.
It was something you never discussed with your fellow astronauts?
I remember one discussion with Paul Weitz, who was the commander of our spacecraft, and basically he said, there's some risk in this, and if that's going to bother you, you ought not to go. And if it's not going to bother you, you ought to put it out of your mind and get on with the job. And that's the only discussion that I remember with other astronauts.
Was it something that you felt that your training prepared you for? Did NASA officials talk to you all and say, hey, wait a minute, you must understand, this thing could blow up there, you could die or be seriously injured? Was it part of your training at all?
No, sir, not in that sense. The NASA hires people for these positions that are fairly knowledgeable people in engineering and science, and most of those people understand that you don't build perfect devices and that occasionally a device will fail. And what we had today was a catastrophic failure, and in this program that's been very rare.
Senator Glenn and other fellow astronauts said today that there was a feeling, though, among astronauts that this was bound to happen someday. Did you have that feeling?
I suppose if you're saying the space program is going to go on for hundreds of years, that sooner or later a spacecraft will fail, I think, yes, that's probably an inevitable occurrence. I would not say that I expected it on the 25th flight of the shuttle or the 50th flight of the shuttle, or if you named a flight, I think the odds are that you'd be very safe.
Was Mr. Scott told Robin earlier that the shuttle was considered a relatively safe way to go into space vis-a-vis some of the earlier Apollo and other flights. Would you agree with that?
I think the shuttle has, over the years that it's operated, has proven to be a very safe vehicle, notwithstanding what happened today.
Did you feel safe when you were up there?
Yes, sir. I flew in the Challenger vehicle. We never had a minute's trouble with any phase of the flight, and everything went exactly like it was supposed to.
During the first minute or two of launch, was there any anxiety, a special anxiety that if something went wrong, was more likely to happen here than some other time during the flight?
My personal feeling is that what risk there is to these flights that is probably greater during the early minutes of ascent than anywhere else. And the reason I think that risk is greater is that there are not many options or not many alternatives at that point. If something very serious goes wrong in the first couple of minutes of a flight, it's very difficult to overcome that. Later in the flight, there's a great deal more leeway and time for solving problems and more alternatives for dealing with them.
Colonel Peterson, thank you.
Yes,
Robin?
sir.
What's your reaction, David Scott, to Professor Gold's ideas on the manned space program?
Well, I guess I'd like to say that in all due respect for Professor Gold's accomplishments, his opinions as reflected in his recent comments are not representative of those of his colleagues. I've worked very closely with the scientific and the technical communities for about 25 years in space, and I've become acquainted and familiar with many of the people who are the drivers behind the scientific exploration, the technological exploration that we are conducting. And I think the vast majority of them would disagree with Professor Gold's opinion.
And your opinion, or you think theirs wouldn't be changed, as he says it should be changed as a result of today's tragedy, that it shouldn't be rethought, the whole program?
I believe the program has to be rethought in light of what happened today so as to be able to correct that. But in terms of the overall objectives of space exploration, science in space, technology in space, absolutely not. I think we're on the right track. I think the country has vision and perception, and unfortunately there are those in the minority who, there's a good part to it. They keep us straight and they keep us thinking clearly.
Professor Gold, are you in a very small minority?
I don't think so at all. I think that the great majority of the people concerned with planetary exploration would be on the same side as I am. It is not at all true that most scientists are in favor of manned spaceflight. They're very much in favor, as I'm also, of pursuing in a hard way, and harder than we've been doing, the whole business of space science and also the utilitarian flights. But to send men where they're not needed, I don't agree.
Jerry Gray, as a space buff yourself, but also as a journalist, where do you think the balance of this argument lies?
You struck the right word, balance. The proper way to do what we've been doing is a balance. The photographs that came back from Uranus were on the same front page of the New York Times as a discussion of the shuttle launch, and that's proper. We should do both activities. Remember, although Dr. Gold is correct, most of the planetary scientists would be interested in seeing less manned flight. There is also another aspect of science. There are many life scientists who love the idea of being able to experiment. There are many observational scientists who like to look down on the Earth physically and be able to move their cameras and change them. There's a great deal of science that can be done from the shuttle. But more important, we are building a whole new industrial capability. And to try to do it totally with robots or automation just doesn't make sense. Man is still the perfect multi-purpose computer and should be used with robotics to the maximum extent.
So what should today's event lead to? Simply finding out the cause and correcting that, or a basic rethink of what we're doing?
I think we need to find out what happened on the shuttle today very critically to make sure that it never happens again. I think that's urgent.
But that's sufficient?
I think we might want to rethink the pattern of how we launch a number of, I would call them operational aspects. But to change the basic thrust of our space program today, I think that would be a mistake.
I know you think, you agree with that. Professor, and Mr. Peterson, you agree with that, that find out what's wrong and correct it, but don't change the basic thrust? Is that?
I agree with that. I also think that it would be a mistake at this point to stop using the shuttle for very long, even though this investigation might take a while, because I think the shuttle is a key part of our launch capability in this country, and it's necessary that we keep on flying these vehicles.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Professor Gray in Syracuse, Mr. Peterson in Houston, Thomas Gold and Jerry Gray in New York. Jim?
7 Americans died in that explosion downrange from Cape Canaveral, Florida this morning.